Hey, so I'm going to read aloud onto the video a section out of my book, out of the first section, Preparing for Descent, on mapping the underworld. Like I thought of just talking to it, and I was like, when I looked at the book, I thought, really, perhaps I'll just read it. Perhaps you love being read aloud too. Perhaps you're going to skip this section entirely. I don't know. But this is part of considering, like standing up the top in a way, considering descending. Sometimes it's like, why would we do that? And other times it's like, well, how will we know how to do that? And so this is my attempt to answer that in the mythic terms. Mapping the underworld. If you've got the book and you'd rather read it yourself, it starts on page 19. This would all be terrifying if there wasn't some kind of a map, a how-to, with directions so clear that you really can't get it wrong. It's still hard, don't mistake that, hard and necessary, and sometimes we experience it as grim and devastating, but it's possible. There is a map. It's been passed down in the Greek myths, stories of Persephone's descent and return, Orpheus's journey to rescue his beloved, and Psyche's attempt to win Aphrodite's favour. This map also exists in immaculate precision in the Egyptian tomb writings and their elaborate instructions for each hour as one passes through the realm of the dead. More emotively, but with little specific detail, it's written into the Bible as the myth of Jesus' death and resurrection. You can even watch it every month as the moon gradually turns to dark by increments, vanishes and then reappears, born anew but different, or every year at the winter solstice as the days shorten progressively until, a miracle, they turn around and begin lengthening again. There is another story that tells not just the events, but the actual step-by-step of how to do it. It's the Sumerian story of the goddess Inanna's descent to the underworld and her eventual return. Inanna's story, her voice, actions and responses sound familiar to us, understandable and immediate. This is a powerful and moving story that was saved from the endless editing and rewriting that some other stories have suffered from by the clay tablets that record it being buried in the desert until mid-last century. This means that, translated, we get the myth that the Sumerians recorded 4,000 years ago. This myth has been used as a model for women's psychological development by a number of writers, most famously in Sylvia Brinton Pereira's Descent to the Goddess. In all of these myths, a protagonist makes a deliberate descent and transition through the underworld. Descents, underworld journeys, and meetings with the dark goddess can be deliberately entered into, not just in myth or story, but by ourselves, and that's the main focus of this book. I believe that all of us have, at least once, but probably many times throughout our lives, experienced these things without having consciously chosen to undergo them, and without a map. I believe this is terrain that we have travelled since we were children or teenagers. Not only does our culture have very little understanding or tolerance of this, but because we don't understand the necessity of such journeys and their place in the balance of our lives, we spend a great deal of energy postponing, avoiding, and denying them. This avoidance, denial, and postponement may be not only pointless, but also regressive. In the end, we go down, and any energy we might have used to resist seems to add to the force with which we are propelled and held there. Sometimes we have spent years down there in the underworld, hardly knowing how we got there and certainly not knowing how to get out. We might have begun the descent, perhaps not of our conscious choosing, and then become stuck halfway. Maybe we missed a crucial step in the proceedings and are unable to complete our journey. This can result in the feeling of living a half-life, just waiting for real life to resume, or even in giving up and resigning ourselves to a shadow-like existence. We may hardly recognize ourselves in the actual life we are living. These are symptoms of an underworld journey that is incomplete. When we study the maps and practice walking these paths deliberately, the manifestations of sickness, depression, and alienation are far less severe and we make discoveries that are hard to make when we're in the grip of real-life trauma. Walking into the underworld willingly, we have much freer access to the deep personal transformation, which is an essential part of this journey, the renewal of the soul. It's a young woman who ventures into the dark, to the dark goddess in the myths, throwing out all our preconceptions that it should be a crone or at least a wise woman who travels these paths. Persephone and Psyche are both young and even naive. Inanna, although already a queen, is robust with youth. To read this symbolically, we should not wait for wisdom in order to make our descent. Should not or cannot. The youth of these protagonists shows that when we enter the underworld, we are starting from the basis of not knowing. And compared with the dark goddess, the part of us that makes this journey is young indeed. There are a number of related fields to this journey into the dark goddess, including shamanistic soul retrieval and shadow work. During soul retrieval, parts of the soul that have become lost or separated are retrieved by a shaman from the underworld and reclaimed for the one who lost them. Another approach in the field of personal development is known as shadow work. Shadow work addresses areas of darkness in an individual's life or behavior or personality, or sometimes those of a whole culture. These can be repressed traits, prejudices, areas of denial, addiction, and self-limitation. Shadow work and soul retrieval, while valuable in themselves, do not address the fundamental imbalance we carry between dark and light. In both, the dark is cast as largely bad or undesirable, and both seek to bring everything into the light to enlighten. Shadow work in particular is not about according darkness half of the playing field. My reading is that shadow work is actually part of the light half of life, the daylight side. It deals with dark issues in the light. In true darkness, after all, no shadows are to be seen. So fundamentally, shadow work can only occur in the light. As part of the integration between light and dark, this is perfect because it is in the brightest, most empowered, and most glorious places that issues such as fear, loss, death, and letting go are highlighted. The deepest shadow is cast by the strongest light is not just a metaphor. It's the literal truth. In darkness, contrastingly, we look for birth, transformation, and new beginnings. Shadow work can function as an overture towards actual darkness, for its promises of personal empowerment and recognizing the true self are deeply related to the dark goddess. Approaching the dark goddess, however, involves a surrender on the deepest levels. This is a mythic, archetypal, and initiatory journey, the specific results of which cannot be known, or often even imagined, beforehand. Dark goddess work and underworld journeys belong in the actual dark, where there are no shadows and everything is merged. That is, until a light is struck, and that light is the light of dawn, of the birth or rebirth of the soul. Inanna's preparation for descent to the underworld. Queen of all heaven and earth, Inanna, who in Babylon was known as Ishtar, is a young and powerful goddess in the Sumerian mythos. The culture that birthed this goddess, Mesopotamia, is called the cradle of civilization. It lay at the meeting places of two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This fertile crescent of the ancient world gave birth to agriculture, writing, astronomy, and early civilization. There was a vast temple system that oversaw land management, justice, sacred rites, and civil celebrations. Over all of this presided the gods, and at one particular time, the queen of all the gods was Inanna. We know her stories from the clay tablets inscribed 4,000 years ago and discovered, pieced together, and translated only during the last century. The Inanna of these stories has defied and defeated gods much older than herself through a combination of wit, daring, and courage to assume great powers that were not originally hers. She is brave and beautiful, mistress of both the battlefield and the bedroom, presiding over temples and courts. The love poetry between Inanna and her consort Dumuzi is famous for its sensual, evocative explicitness. Their lovemaking is celebrated throughout the country as that which literally brings the animals to bear their young and the fields to ripen. Inanna is adored by all. She is the morning and the evening star that we call Venus, and she shares many attributes with that goddess. She's used to getting what she wants. The story of her encounter with the dark goddess is nearly complete in its preservation and can easily be read in its translations and interpretations. Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, Her Stories and Hymns from Sumer by Diane Volkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer is accessible and beautifully translated. Inanna gives several reasons for her journey into the underworld, most enigmatically that she hears it calling her. Another reason she gives is that she's going to take part in the funeral rites of her sister's husband, the great bull of heaven. The third possible reason for her visit is that this trip is another journey for the covert accumulation of her powers. Previously, she has visited and tricked a number of gods, elder to and more powerful than herself, assuming their powers when she succeeds. She never mentions it, but it is possible that the Queen of Heaven and Earth has a domain of the underworld in her sights. Inanna has to go to the underworld. For the story to work, she has to go. To reunite with her sister and to bring together what has been split apart, the light and the dark halves of the Sumerian goddess, she must venture down there. But the dark goddess does not leave the underworld, and as she holds the powers of both birth and death, she has no need to. It is others who must journey to her realm. Inanna knows that travellers to the underworld do not return, and although she seems to believe that she will be exempt from this, she does make provisions for her rescue, just in case. She assigns Ninshaba, her loyal retainer, to wait outside the first gate that leads into the underworld. If Inanna does not return in 3 days and 3 nights, Ninshaba is to go for help. She is told to visit certain temples in a certain order and to appeal directly to the gods there. Inanna is sure that they will not let her remain forever in the underworld. Inanna also prepares for her journey by arraying herself in 7 garments of power and radiance. It has been pointed out before that this is not usually the way one arrives at a funeral. These garments and objects are not just symbols of her power, they are the actual powers themselves. Thus, her measuring rod and line, made of lapis lazuli, doesn't just show that she's the one who measures out the fields and decides in the courts on matters of justice. It literally is the object that has those powers. Her possession of it grants her those powers. Thus, its loss would mean the loss of those powers. So Inanna sets off into the underworld, much against the perceived wisdom and any understanding of how the universe works. After all, she is the goddess of heaven and earth, most specifically not the underworld. And since she has a history of visiting other gods in order to wrest their powers away from them or trick them into surrendering those powers, you might think her arrival would be looked upon dubiously. And I always worried that several of the gods she so blithely entrusted her rescue to were those same gods that she had stolen powers from previously. The Queen of Heaven and Earth is undeniably arrogant. Imagining Inanna. I heard it calling me, the underworld. Well, I heard a faint voice. I thought it came from there, from under my feet, from my sister, Dark Ereshkigal, all alone down in the underworld, mourning, surely, the death of her husband. I decided then to visit her, to pay a call. A difficult place, the underworld. No one I knew had ever gone there and returned. But I, as the Queen of Heaven and Earth, surely I could travel there and return. She would not refuse me. I gathered up my regalia. She would meet me in all my glory. I placed the crown of the steps upon my brow. It conferred my queenship. Around my throat, I placed the precious lapis beads and also the double strand of beads that fell to my breast. I bound about me my breastplate, famous on the battlefield and also in the bedroom. I have welcomed men onto my spear and also into my arms. I wore the gold armband high on my arm, and in my hand I carried my lapis measuring rod and line, that which was the power of measuring out the land. About my body I placed the robe of royalty. I took with me my most loyal Ninshaba. She I set to watch at the first gate. If I do not return in 3 days and 3 nights, I told her, you must go for help. This she willingly agreed to. I told her which temples to travel to, which gods to appeal to. Surely they would not leave me, Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, their precious jewel, to rot in the ground. I had every faith I would return, one way or another. I rapped on the first gate. There was a long wait, a lot of scuttling around, and then, slowly, the first gate opened for me. I, Inanna, queen of all Sumer, approached the underworld. The Sumerian stories, and pivotally the Gilgamesh myth, are a marker of the advent of patriarchy, the point in the Middle East culture where control and power passed out of the hands of the temples and into those of the king. Gilgamesh, history's first recorded king according to these stories, refused to join in sacred marriage with the goddess Inanna. Traditionally, the king's source of power would have been this very thing, his alliance with the temples, as symbolized by the yearly rite of the sacred marriage, and his refusing it, yet remaining king and indeed engendering a line of kings, surely denotes the ending of this old system of the distribution of power in the city-states. Perhaps Inanna's venture into the underworld is part of her battle with Gilgamesh. If she were victorious down there and able to combine the powers of the underworld with her own powers, maybe she would stand a chance. In a little circular unfolding of events, Inanna was so furious at Gilgamesh's rejection of her, or Gilgamesh's effective challenge to an overthrowing of the temples, that she caused the bull of heaven to be released to battle Gilgamesh and show the extent of her wrath. As history or myth will have it, Gilgamesh and his comrade Enkidu killed the bull, an almost unimaginable act. This can be aligned astrologically with the precession of the equinoxes and the passing of the bull sign, Taurus, into that of the ram, Aries, which occurred at about this time. This bull of heaven, Gugalana, was the husband of Inanna's sister, Ereshkigal. It is his funeral rites Inanna experiences a sudden need to go and witness down in the underworld. No wonder her own sister was a little mad at her. I'm just going to skip a bit there, my own story, but you can read about it if you want, and read this bit, preparation for descent in other myths. Persephone and Psyche are 2 other goddesses whose stories include a descent into the underworld. Their myths have been subject to any number of rewritings, forgettings, and imaginings during the years between when the ancient Greeks recorded them and us reading them now. Also translations, of course. They remain, however, vivid and popular in their retellings, and as with Inanna's descent, many commentators, analysts, and novelists have been inspired by their stories. Changes to a myth can be made for cultural reasons, to render a myth more understandable to a certain audience, children, for example, or those of a different culture or time, or more politic reasons, such as to turn what may originally have been a myth empowering women into one that teaches women a very different lesson. There are also cases of genuine misinterpretation, either through language difficulties or cultural differences. Perhaps all of this has occurred to these particular myths, but I think it's not hard to get back to something approaching the original or fundamental story behind our current, commonly recognized stories of Persephone and Psyche. Often what changes in successive versions of myths or fairy stories, or possibly even the stories we tell about our own lives, is not so much the events that occur as the interpretation of those events. It's the motivations, emotions, and the implied consequences of certain behaviours that are subject to such interpretation and reinterpretation, thus inadvertently or purposefully changing the listener's understanding of the myth. When we simply look at the events of the myth, devoid of the meaning assigned to them, quite logical, but previously hidden or ignored, alternate meanings present themselves, explaining events and characters' actions quite differently. At the very least, the stories become open. The events can be viewed free of any judgment of narration. Since myths encase sacred mysteries, I believe they were always and fundamentally about a multiplicity of meanings, open to interpretation. Some of these meanings are paradoxical. That is, different interpretations can coexist. Both Persephone and Psyche's stories abound in such paradoxes. Persephone. Persephone is the only daughter of the Greek grain goddess Demeter. At this early stage of her story, she does not have a name, being known as Kore, a word meaning maiden. She's not strongly differentiated from her mother, and sometimes Kore is depicted simply as a younger version of Demeter. Demeter's realms are the orchards and fields of cultivated land, and she is occupied with the increase of life, the production of corn and grain, the birthing of lambs, and the flowering and fruiting of trees. Wherever she goes, her daughter goes with her. I imagine a baby Kore cuddled up to her mother's breast, wanting nothing more. I imagine Kore as a small child, playing in the meadow with flowers and lambs, knowing nothing else. When I think of her growing up, I imagine her playing in streams and wondering where they go, wanting to follow them. I imagine her lingering at the edges of the woods, wanting to know what's in there. I imagine her climbing trees to spy out different places, maybe cities or deserts or the sea. But Demeter does not go to those places, and Kore is always with Demeter. Kore grows up. Demeter does not have a partner, a consort. Why would she think that Kore might want one or have one? Demeter is happy in her endless summer. Why would Kore want anything different? Is this not a very common mother and daughter story? Demeter is endlessly busy. Would she notice that Kore is not quite so involved in what is, after all, Demeter's work? Would she notice, other than distractedly, if Kore began drifting towards the edges of things like a teenager does, maybe twisting her hair around her fingers while she yearned and dreamed for something different? Could Demeter conceive that an entire repudiation of her way of life is about to come, or would she just think, that girl will grow out of it? What did our mothers think? And what do we, as mothers, think of our daughters? Because what happens, the event that occurs, is that one day the earth opens up and Kore disappears into the underworld. In the story, there's a flower, and I imagine it growing at the edge of the cultivated places, the edge of the wild, that the maiden had never seen before. And when she went over to it, to pick it up, to smell it, to be seduced by it, a gaping hole opened in the earth, and the passage to the underworld was revealed. She vanished into it, and by the time she returned, she'd eaten the pomegranate seeds and become Persephone. The whole thing reads like a metaphor for the sexual act. Current versions have it that Hades, lord of the underworld, had his eye on Kore for a wife. Since he knew Demeter would never agree, he created the flower to attract the young maiden and then abducted her, possibly with a chariot and 6 snorting black horses. Feminist rewrites suggest that maybe she just went looking for her own life, and the flower is a symbol for a world beyond her mother's world. But maybe she was drawn to a demon lover, a god brimming with seductive sexuality who promised to take her away from her mother and change her life forever. I think the flower symbolizes her own, just discovered sexuality and that she went willing. But whatever occurred, she vanished. And someone heard it happen. The goddess Hecate, the crone goddess who guards the crossroads of choices and of life and death. She was the only witness to the descent of the young goddess. Psyche. Psyche's story begins, unfortunately. Too pretty for mortal comprehension, she's compared to the goddess Aphrodite. Although Psyche's 2 sisters marry, no one will approach her father for Psyche's hand. Her otherworldly beauty is too much for them. Meanwhile, Aphrodite becomes furious that her own temples are neglected by those who worship beauty in favor of this mortal girl. She arranges for Psyche to be removed, telling Psyche's parents to prepare her for marriage to a fearful monster and then chain her to the top of a mountain. In awe of the goddess of love and beauty, the parents do as they have been instructed. Aphrodite then sends her own son, Eros, also known by his Roman name, Cupid, with his bow and arrows to ensure the ending of Psyche. but seeing her while she sleeps, Eros is awed by her beauty. He manages to prick himself with one of his own arrows, and it's hard to imagine that this is anything more than a story told to his mother afterwards, thus falling in love with the maiden. He's in a bit of a bind now, caught between mother and beloved, so he calls upon the west wind to waft Psyche down into a secluded mountain valley where he has a palace with invisible servants who will provide for her every need. Surely it's more than coincidence that the west wind was the very same wind that blew Aphrodite ashore when she was born from the sea. This double appearance of the west wind indicates more than a passing relationship between Psyche and Aphrodite, and has echoes of Demeter and Kore's relationship, that of the older, younger versions of one goddess. Once Psyche is in his palace, Eros visits her nightly, secretly, and without revealing who he is. They are lovers, but he tells her that if she ever sees his face, he will come no longer. So the thing is begun, the great love story of Psyche, the soul, and Eros, love. The soul is in love with love, and love, which is the god, is in love with the soul of a mortal, and it takes place in darkness. There are many interpretations of this darkened courting of Eros and Psyche. Their very names translate as love and soul. Is he, love, after all, a fearful monster she was promised to, and her vision of him would cement that meaning? It has been cited as the darkness of ignorance, as in love is blind. There's also the inference that a mortal is not allowed to see the gods clearly, but can only experience them in the dark places, hidden as the truth of them is hidden. But I suspect it has a more essential meaning, which is that the moment of impregnation, sperm into ovum, to be followed by the cell dividing and new life, happens in the darkness of the body. The moment of a seed casing cracking open to send a root out happens in the dark earth. And in this darkened time of loving, Psyche does become pregnant to her lover. Events progress. Psyche asks to see her sister Zan with misgivings. Eros allows the visit. Her sisters plant seeds of doubt in her mind, saying that since Psyche has never seen her lover, undoubtedly he's a demon or a monster. They implore Psyche to take a lantern while he was sleeping one night and gaze upon his face, and Psyche eventually does this. When she gazes upon Eros, she recognizes him for the god he is, and simultaneously, one drop of burning oil from the lamp falls onto his skin and wakens him. As he has always threatened to do under these circumstances, he leaves. Why exactly does he leave? Why was it so important Psyche never saw his face? Why would Aphrodite, who's remained in ignorance of Psyche's whereabouts and her son's activities until now, be any the wiser? Perhaps the myth has simply come to a new stage of itself, where out of the darkness and new choices must be made. The drop of burning oil is one of realization. Psyche has realized who her lover is, and Eros has realized he can conceal himself no longer. Once Psyche understands Eros is not returning, she sets out to find him. She goes to many temples and beseeches help from many gods and goddesses. All tell her the same thing, that the only one who can help her is Aphrodite. Eventually, reluctantly, Psyche goes to Aphrodite's temple and makes suitable offerings and prostrations. Aphrodite sets Psyche 4 tasks. In the versions I've read, she seems determined that Psyche will not succeed at these tasks, but that's an interpretation. Her actions are to set the tasks. None of these tasks, and Psyche succeeds at the first 3, are things it is possible for a mortal human to accomplish. Yet Psyche, with help, advice, and support from various non-human quarters, accomplishes them. With the help of some ants, she separates a pile of mixed seeds into their component parts. With the advice and help of the plants growing nearby, she gathers a bag of fleece from the ferocious golden rams. And with the help of an eagle, sometimes thought to be Zeus himself, she obtains a goblet of water from the river Lethe, or the Styx. Perhaps her success is giving us a clue that she is special beyond merely her beauty, and even, perhaps, that Aphrodite is playing a role greater than that of jealous goddess. Aphrodite's demands of Psyche force her to face challenges, make alliances, and grow up it could be seen that she is preparing Psyche for something. The fourth task Aphrodite assigns Psyche is to venture into the underworld and retrieve a box of beauty ointment from Persephone, the dark goddess. Psyche, who throughout the entire story has regularly given way to fits of despair, takes herself up a high tower and prepares to dash herself to the ground. It's almost the exact opposite of what she's been told to do. She's told to go into the underworld, and instead she climbs a high tower. Perhaps this is similar to what we ourselves do. When we feel forced to enter the underworld, we attempt to get as far away as possible. The tower speaks to Psyche as do the reeds growing down the bottom of the tower. The tower and the reeds have links to both heaven and the underworld by virtue of their vertical structure, planted in the ground but reaching upwards. Between them, they tell Psyche where to find the entrance to the underworld and what to take with her. She is to take 2 coins for the ferryman, 1 for the crossing in each direction, and 2 pieces of bread for the 3-headed guard dog, 1 for the way in and 1 for the way out. She is told to stay focused on her task and ignore all distractions, even if these are pleas for help. Importantly, she's also instructed not to open the box of beauty ointment once she receives it. So that's a little section out of my book, my interpretation or views on those 3 particular myths of the preparation stage of getting ready to make the descent, or beginning to get ready. And so that's it for this recording, but you've got some tasks in all my other videos and documents to do your own preparation for your descent. But also feel free, of course, to read into the myths, either the original myths themselves or interpretations of, or work with the myths. I've put up a whole list of resources in the front section of this folder, including novels, plays, poetry, what have you, and many other books. So enjoy those explorations. Okay, thanks.